Hey everyone, in this video we're going to translate the chapter 32 story from the Ecce textbook. So before we do that, like I always tell you, the first thing you got to do, make sure you have the vocab under control, read through it as best as you can, memorize all the words to the best of your ability. It just makes it easier when you're trying to translate to know what the words mean so you're not constantly living in the dictionary. So do that, look at some derivatives so you can sort of associate the words with English. Whatever you can do to understand the meaning and feel comfortable with the vocab, that's always the first step. Then you want to go back and make sure you look through the grammar and have a good sense of how the grammar is going to work. And we'll do a little recap of that in this video too, just so to make sure that you feel comfortable with it. Because again, the whole idea is you want to read and be able to recognize these new grammar pieces of grammar so that you can translate and kind of see them in context instead of just seeing them sort of in practice sentences in the textbook. See them in the context of a story. It'll just make it easier to understand for you. So always do the grammar too. Once you feel comfortable with those, the last thing you should always be doing is reading this story aloud. So find a partner, read it out loud to them, work on your pronunciation, then have them read it back to you so you can work on your listening. And I know I always say this in these videos, but it does help a lot to have that speaking and listening component, right? It's hard to learn a language when you're not actually hearing it, and you don't want to shut off that part of your learning and only be looking at sort of reading and translating in your head. You need that spoken part too, and the listening skills to help you really understand how the language works, and you'll start to catch the different patterns and the endings and things like that. It's just a really good skill to develop in the background too. So like I said, we're going to start with a little review of the grammar, just to make sure that you're feeling confident in it and that you're not being confused when you see the new pieces as we go. So the first thing we want to do is look at the passive voice. And you want to remember that the passive voice is when the subject isn't doing anything, but something's happening to it. So it's the difference I put here between I see versus I am seen, right? When you say I see, I, the subject, is actually doing something. I'm seeing something. If you say I am seen, I'm not doing anything. Someone else is seeing me, is kind of the idea. So that's the difference between active and passive voice. And so far in earlier chapters, we learned the present, the imperfect, and the future tense, right? And we learned that they pretty much follow the same rules as active voice, but they're just using different endings, right? So instead of OST, musste sunt, or maybe bomba spot, or bo be be boo, right? You're using the passive voice endings of R, R-I-S-T-U-R, M-U-R, M-I-N-I, N-T-U-R. But otherwise, you're following the same pattern. Okay, and the reason we chunk these together is because they all start from the same place. You start with the infinitive and you go from there. Now you're going to get the next chunk, the next three tenses: perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect. And the reason that we put these together is because they follow a different process. They're not going to look like their active voice forms, right? So in active voice, you'd be starting with the third principal part, and you've been changing the endings to make perfect, pluperfect, or future perfect tense. Here, we're not doing that. So it's worth pausing and putting them together just so you can understand how we actually do put these into passive voice. So for these, when it comes to passive voice, so again, in active voice, you would start with the third principal part for all of these. In passive voice, you start with the fourth principal part, which is the major difference, right? The fourth principal part is that participle form, the perfect passive participle, right? So it's the form of the verb that looks like an adjective. So you have to take that fourth principal part and you add on a version or a form of essay to it. And this is how you can distinguish between the tenses. So they all have some form of essay, and the tense of essay tells you what tense you're putting in the passive voice. So in other words, to make a perfect tense passive voice verb, you would do the fourth principal part plus the present tense of essay. So sum ss, sum est sum. If you do that, you're doing perfect tense passive voice. If you want to do the pluperfect tense in the passive voice, it's the fourth principal part and the imperfect of essay. So eram, eras, erat, and down the line. The future perfect tense, when you put it in the passive voice, is the fourth principal part, and then you're doing the future tense of essay. So what does this all look like, right? We're going to look in a second, but it's about translating, right? And thinking about how this is going to work when you're putting it into English. The perfect passive is translated have or has been. So I have been seen. Pluperfect is had been, right? So I had been seen would be the example. And again, pluperfect happens before perfect tense. The future perfect is will have been. So you'd say, I will have been seen. So you can tell they're still kind of mimicking the same translation, right? Active voice would be, I have done something for perfect, or I had done something pluperfect, or will have for future perfect. But now we're making it passive. That's where the been comes in. So I have been seen, I had been seen, I will have been seen. So here's an example of what these all look like if you put it together. And I just gave you an example verb of porto, portare, but take a look. All of them are starting with the fourth principal part, portatus, and then they're using a different tense of essay. That's how you make the difference between these tenses. So if you look at the different tenses here, look at that form of esse, right? In the perfect passive, we have sum est, present tense of esse. In the pluperfect, you have eram, eras, erat, which is the imperfect of esse. And in the future perfect, you have ero, eris, erit, which is the future form of esse, right? The one thing you do want to pay attention to, again, is since you're dealing with a fourth principal part, a participle, there's gender involved. So it's portatus aum, and the ending is going to depend on whether your subject is masculine, feminine, or neuter. And it's also going to depend on whether it's singular or plural. So you'll note here in the bottom of the chart, the plural form, it's not us anymore, it's ei-a, right? The plural form of us So you just want to make sure that you're always paying attention to that, because there is a major difference is that when you're using the participle, you have to have case number gender, which is what I put here, just a note for you. So again, because it's an adjective, a verbal adjective, a participle, you need case number gender, and that's why the endings are flipping from us to ei-a. Okay, so now that you feel pretty good about that grammar, hopefully, and you've had a quick refresher of it, we're ready to dive into the actual story for chapter 32. And we'll point out the different tenses if they're in the passive voice as we go, just so you can start seeing them and understanding how they work. So the story starts like this. You have abhinc tres dies amici quidam a Gaio Cornelio ad cenam invitati eram. So you have 3 days ago, right? The certain friends, amici quidam, there's your subject. So some friends, they invitati erant. This is our first look at a passive voice verb that's pluperfect. You can tell because it's invitati, right, is the fourth principal part of the verb invitare, to invite, and it has the imperfect form of esse with it, erant. So this is pluperfect. So you're saying amici quidam, right, some friends had been invited. That's how you would translate invitati erant. They had been invited. And notice how invitati, right, is matching amici. They're both masculine, plural, and nominative in this case, right, because it's a subject. So they're going together. That's why we're spelling it with a long I. So some friends had been invited by Gaius Cornelius, right? There's our ablative of agent. We have a passive voice verb, so the ablative tells you who did it. By Gaius Cornelius ad cenam, to dinner. Right, and ad takes an accusative noun, which is why you have cenam. So it's saying they were invited to get to dinner. Quade causa Aurelia in foro glires emera. So you have because of this reason, or quade causa for this reason, you could say. Aurelia emera, she had bought. Right? What had she bought? It's pluperfect tense, active voice, right? So emerat is just the third principal part of emere, to buy, with erat stuck on it, right? The imperfect of the verb to be. So it's active voice. She had bought glire. She had bought dormice in foro, in the forum, right? And that's the story we've already seen. She went down with Cornelia into the forum. She went to the merchant and she bought the glires, right? Then you have porcus quoque asudula emptus erat. So a pig, a porcus, there's your subject, also emptus erat. Here's another pluperfect passive voice verb, right? You can tell because emptus is a fourth principal part from emere, to buy. It's agreeing in case number gender with porcus, by the way, which is why it's got the US ending. And it has the imperfect form of esse attached to it, emptus erat. So you're saying a pig had been bought a pseudulo, by pseudolus, right? There's your ablative of agent. So again, it's just saying, recapping what we already know from previous chapters. Aurelia and Cornelia went to buy the dormice, and pseudolus went off to buy the pig. Then you have Yam, dies Canai aderat. So now, or you could say sort of finally or now, the day of the dinner, right? Canai is genitive. So the day of the dinner had arrived. Aderat, right? Pluperfect, it had arrived. Mane servi in fora misi sunt et ibi comperaverant holera panem pulos. So early in the morning, mane, the slaves, right, the servi, misi sunt. Here we have a fourth principal part, misi, but it's with the present tense of esse, misi sunt. So it's perfect passive. So you're not saying they had been sent, you're saying they have been sent. So early in the morning, slaves have been sent. You could almost say they were sent. It would mean the same thing. They were sent in forum, into the forum. Right? And notice how misi is agreeing in case number gender with servi, our subject. So they were sent to the forum, and there, ibi, comparaverant, right? They bought holera, panem, and pulos. Holera, they bought vegetables, panem is bread, and pulos is chicken, right? Chickens. So it's talking about how, basically Aurelia had sent slaves to go get the rest of the ingredients, right? They have the main stuff for the dinner, but they sent slaves to go get the rest of it, the other stuff. And we keep going. We have ova quoque et mala et multa alia comparata sunt. Nam cum senato Romanus amicos ad cenam invitavit, cena optima parari debet. So oa are eggs. So it says also, quoque, eggs also, and mala, apples, right? That doesn't mean evil. Remember, that's mala, an apple. So apples. And multa alia comparata sunt. Multa alia means many others. There's substantive adjectives here. So you're really saying many other things. It's neuter plural, right? Substantive. So you're saying eggs and apples, and many other things also comparata sunt. Here, again, we have the fourth principal part, right? Comparata, going with the present tense form of esse. So it's perfect tense, passive voice. And comparata is agreeing with oa, mala, and multa alia, right? They're all the subject. So you're saying they were bought. You can almost say they have been bought, but were bought works the same. So all these things were bought because when a senator, a Roman senator, a senator Romanus, again, cum here is the causal cum, right? So, or temporal rather. So it's saying when, right? When a Roman senator invitavit, invited, that's perfect tense, just active voice. When he invited friends to dinner, the best dinner, cena optima, right? The best dinner, debet, should or ought to be, you could say. Ought, parari. Here's a passive infinitive. It doesn't mean to prepare. It means to be prepared. So you're saying when a Roman senator invited, his friends to dinner, the best dinner should be prepared, or you could say ought to be prepared. Then we continue. We have yam ora kenai apropinquabat. So now the hour of the dinner. So in the previous section, we had the day of the dinner, the dies kenai. Now we have the ora kenai. The hour of the dinner was approaching, right? Imperfect tense, it was approaching. Dum in culina kibus coquebator ancilai triclinium parabat. So while in the kitchen, kibus, the food, coquebator, it's imperfect passive voice. So the food was being cooked, right? In culina is just in the kitchen. It's ablative because you're showing the location, right? So while the food was being cooked in the kitchen, the ancilai, the slave women, parabant, they were preparing the triclinium, right? The triclinium is the dining room, remember. Then you have mensa a servis in medium triclinium jam alata erat. Tres lecti circum mensam posite erat. So you have the mensa, the table, right? By the slaves, we have an ablative of agent. So we're looking for a passive voice verb somewhere. It's alata erat. Here again, we have the fourth principal part, alata, going with the imperfect form of esse. So alata erat. And again, alata here is describing mensa, right? And it's not plural, it's singular. You can tell because you have erat, the singular form of the verb, right? So what's going on here is it's saying the table, right? Now, having been prepared, right? So having been, alata, brought in, right, by the slaves into the middle of the table. And again, sorry, the mensa here, you're talking about the table being prepared by the slaves. You're saying it had already been brought into the middle of the triclinium, right? So it had already been brought, yam, and again, had been is that pluperfect tense. You're saying it had been brought in, a servis, by the slaves. So they brought the table into the middle of the triclinium. And three beds, tres lecti, right? 3 beds, positi erant. Here again, you have the pluperfect form, passive voice, right? So you have positi erant, they had been placed, right? Positi is from the verb ponere, to place. Erant is the imperfect of to be. So you have pluperfect passive voice. You're saying 3 beds had been placed, circum mensam, around the table. So first they brought in the table, then they bring in the beds to go around it, the 3 beds, right? Which is why it's called a triclinium. Then we have triclinium Cornelii erat pulcherrimum atque ornatissimum. So the triclinium, the dining room of Cornelius, right, just genitive, the dining room of Cornelius, erat, it was. It's described as pulcherrimum. So we'll learn this in the coming chapters. It's a superlative. It was the most beautiful is what this means. It was very beautiful, you could say. It was very beautiful, and ornatissimo, it was very ornate. It was very kind of nicely decorated, you might say. And both of those are describing the triclinium, right? In parietibus erat picturae pulcherrimae. So in parietibus means on the walls, right? The parius of the walls. So it doesn't mean in the walls, it means on them, right? Were picturae pulcherrimae. Again, it's a superlative. Pulcherrimae is describing picturae. So on the walls were the most beautiful pictures, or very beautiful pictures, you could say. And they're about to describe what they are, but they're telling you the dining room is really ornate. It's very well decorated, which makes sense because Cornelius is a Roman senator and he'd be pretty wealthy. So now it's going to describe what the pictures are. You have in alia pictura, canis Cerberus e regno Plutonis extrahebator. In alia Mercurius ad caronem mortuos aducebat. In alia Orpheus ad inferos descendebat. So it's talking about 3 different events here happening in the pictures. So you're saying in one of the pictures, in Alia Pictura, right, on one picture, you have the Canis Cerberus, the dog Cerberus, right? Extrahebator means he was being dragged, a regno Plutonus, out of the kingdom of Pluto, right? And if you dive into this, it's referring to Hercules, right? The labors of Hercules. So one is Hercules dragging Cerberus, right? The three-headed hellhound, right? The guard dog of the underworld, out of the kingdom of Pluto, which is the underworld, right? Pluto, the lord of the underworld, Hades, you'd call him in Greek. That's on one picture. Then you have in Alia on another, we have Mercurius, Mercury, right? What's Mercury doing? Aducebat, he was leading the mortuos, the dead, ad Charonum, to Charon, right? Charon's the boatman, right? So the idea is when you get to, the river of the underworld, the river Styx, you have to cross and you have to pay the boatman to get there. Mercury, the messenger god, is known for leading those dead souls down there too. So it's showing Mercury leading souls to the underworld, basically. Then you have in Alia, in another one, right, in the third one, you could think, Orpheus, right? Orpheus, descendebat, was going down, was descending to the underworld, ad inferos. So what they're hitting on here, just as a side note, are three major myths that you want to look into. So one is talking about, like I said, Hercules and his labor of dragging Cerberus out of the underworld. Another one is the idea of, a function of Mercury and where do people go when they die? How do you get to the underworld? And the last one is Orpheus. Orpheus is the famous myth of the singer who, loses his loved one, his lover, Eurydice, and he goes to the underworld to get her back, right? A very, very famous myth. But all of these are talking about the underworld and death, which is kind of interesting, this death imagery. And we're going to talk about, at the end of the video, we'll talk about why you might put this on the wall. It seems kind of a downer topic to put in your dining room, but we'll kind of discuss it and see how it all works out. So for now, just hold on to that thought and just translate. It's not too bad to translate. Then you have Cornelius, servus festinare eubebat, nam iam erat nona ora. So Cornelius, right, eubebat, he was ordering the servus, the slaves. What was he ordering them to do? Festinare, to hurry, right? Why was he doing this? Because now, yam, it was the 9th hour, right? Nona ora. So it's getting pretty close to dinner time, right? Think the 9th hour after sunrise. You're probably talking somewhere around 3 in the afternoon, give or take, which is about the time they'd want to start the dinner party. So he's telling everyone to hurry up. You have Aurelia, semper solicita, ancilas vehementer incitabat. So Aurelia, always anxious, semper solicita, right? She's always anxious. Incitabat, she was urging on, right? Imperfect tense. She was urging on the ancilas, the slave women. Vehementer means like fiercely, almost violently, but it's really more like vehemently, you might say in English. She was really urging them on. And again, you want to notice how Cornelius orders the slave men, Aurelia orders the slave women. They're hitting on that idea of like who would be ordering who in a Roman household. Then you have subito, ancilla quaedam, quae Aureliam magno per timebat, hoc illoc festinans unum e candelabris, there we go, casu everte. So suddenly, one of the slave women, some slave woman, right? Quaedam is an indefinite adjective. So some slave woman, right? Who was fearing timebat, was fearing Aurelia magno per very much. She was greatly fearing Aurelia. She was hurrying. Festinans is a participle, hurrying. It's describing the slave woman. She was hurrying back and forth, hoc illoc, this way and that. What did she do? Everte. She knocked over one unum of the candelabras, right? The lampstands. And she does this casu, by accident, right? It's ablative. It's explaining kind of how she did it. She did it by accident. Right? So, candelabrum in lectum deiectum est. Statum effusum est oleum in strata, haec celeriter ignem caperum. So you have a couple different things happening here all at once that are being described in this section. So the first thing you have is the candelabra, right? Deiectum est. So this is the fourth principal part plus the present tense of esse, right? So it's a perfect passive. So it's from the verb to throw down. Right? So what you're kind of saying here is the candelabra was thrown down, but a better way to translate it would be it fell, right? But either way, you're going to get at the right idea. So you could say the candelabra, the lampstand, was thrown down onto the lectum, onto the bed. Immediately, oleum diffusum est, right? Diffusum est, again, fourth principal part, present tense of the verb to be, it's perfect passive. So the oil, effusum est, again, it's coming from this idea of fundere, which means to pour out. So what you're really saying is it was poured out, or it was spilled, you could say. So the oil was spilled or was poured out onto the strata, onto the sheet. Right? So it's this idea that it falls onto the bed and it starts going all over the coverings of the sheets, you might say. Then you have haec celeriter, right? These, meaning the sheets, right? They quickly caperent ignem. When you say caperent ignem, what you're getting at here is that they lit on fire. right, is the idea. But literally you're saying they caught fire. But either way you want to parse it, Keperon is just perfect tense. They caught, ignem is flame, so they lit on fire is the idea. There's a fire going on now on one of the beds. You have Aurelia errata, anculum negligentem reprehendebat, sed Cornelius celeriter palio ignem extinxit. So angry Aurelia, right? Aurelia errata, she's angry. So angry Aurelia, she was scolding, reprehendebat, she was scolding the anculum, the slave woman, and it's the negligentem anculum, the careless slave woman. But Cornelius, he quickly extinguished it. He put out or extinguished the flame, the ignem, palio, ablative. It's saying how he did it. He did it with his cloak. So he takes off his cloak and he puts out the flame. And he says, bono animo est, inquit Cornelius. So he says, everything's okay. Bono animo est, like cheer up. It's kind of one way to put it, right? You are in a good mind, literally. So he says, cheer up. Don't worry about it. Ecce, look. Ignis jam extinctus est. So he says, look, now the fire, the ignis, extinctus est. Again, we have a fourth principal part with the verb to be, right? Present tense of esse, it's perfect passive. So he says, now the fire is, has been extinguished, you could say, right? It's been put out. It has been extinguished. Tum aliai ancili ab illa vocatai sunt. So then, right, the other slave women, the aliai ancili, vocatai sunt. Again, it's the fourth principal part, present tense of esse, it's perfect passive. So it's not saying they called anyone, it's saying they were called, right? Or you could say they have been called, either way. So the other slave women were called ab illo, by him, meaning by Cornelius, right? Saying who, the ablative of agent, who called them, right? So they were called by him. And he says, Syra, Phrygia, strata alia ferte. Right? So he says, Syra, Phrygia, right? The two slave women. I think we've met them before. It says, ferte, bring, right? It's a plural positive command, right? Fair is how you tell one person bring something. Ferte, just more than one person. He says, bring strata alia, other sheets, right? So bring some other sheets, he's saying. Necesse est omnia statim reficere, nam convivae mox adera. So he says it's necessary now to redo, reficere, right? To kind of remake or redo. And to redo omnia, everything, statim, immediately. Right? Why? Nam, because, right? Because the dinner guests, the convivae, soon adera, they soon are arriving, right? So he says the dinner guests, they're going to get here quick. They'll soon be here, you could almost say. So he's like, it's time to get everything cleaned up. Right? Omnia Cornelii usa facta sunt. So all the orders, right? Omnia usa, all the orders of Cornelius, Cornelius genitive, all the orders of Cornelius, facta sunt. Again, perfect tense, passive voice. They were done, right? So in other words, he tells the slave women to do this, and everything he tells them to do gets done. So now we continue on. We have ad veniebant convivae in quibus erant cum plures clientes qui ad cenam invitati erant. So now the dinner guests, the convivae, ad veniebant, they were arriving, right? And it's the dinner guests in quibus, among whom, right? It's our relative clause. So among whom there were, erant, cum plures clientes, many clients, right? And again, we've talked about in my class, but if you haven't learned it, feel free to look it up. The patron-client relationship is a really important one in ancient Rome. The clients would be people that Cornelius has basically helped out in one way or another, maybe financially or with legal advice, whatever he can offer them. And in return, they give him, favors, right? They do stuff for him. He helps them. They help him. They would follow him around basically and come say hi to him every day. So they're not quite his friends. These are people that he knows, but he doesn't necessarily like or care too much about. They are important in that relationship, but not as important as his close friends. So it's saying among the dinner guests, there were many clients who, qui, invitati erant. Here it's pluperfect passive. They had been invited to dinner, ad cenam. So if you're a client and you get invited by your patron, it's a really important deal, right? Because it's not expected that you would be invited. Then you have convivae, mappa se cum ferebant, nam cum cena confecta eret, in mappis cibum offere eis licebit. So the dinner guests, right, ferebant, they were carrying se cum, with them, right? It's ablative, cum plus the ablative. So they were carrying with them mappas, napkins, right? Because nam, you have when the dinner, the cena, confecta eret. So here we have the fourth principal part, right? Confecta, plus the verb to be, and the verb to be is in future tense, right? So this is future perfect passive. So you're saying when the dinner will have been completed or will have been finished, you could say, in mappis cibum. So you're saying Likebit, it will be permitted rather for them, eis, ofere, to carry away the kibum, right, the food in mapis, in their napkins. So the idea here is they get to kind of take it as a doggy bag. So they bring napkins, they're probably getting better food than they would normally ever eat, right? So you're allowed to take some in like a doggy bag as like a sort of thank you, I guess, for coming to the dinner, right? So that's why they're carrying in the mapas. Then you have palisper in atrio stabat, cornelium expectantes. So for a short time, right, in atrio, in the atrium, stabat, they were standing, right? So they're standing there for a little bit. And why are they standing there? Well, they're expectantes cornelium. They're waiting for, expectantes is a participle, right? So they're waiting for Cornelius. So they're just standing there waiting. Tandem a Cornelio ipso comiter salutati sunt. So finally, or at last, salutati sunt. Again, we have the fourth principal part plus the present tense of esse. This is perfect tense passive voice. So finally, or at last, they were greeted, right? Salutati sunt. They were greeted by Cornelius himself, and he greets them comiter, graciously, right? So he comes down and he courteously or graciously greets them. And again, it's by Cornelius himself. It's emphasized that he himself comes and greets these people, right? If you're one of the clientes, maybe you weren't expecting him to actually come say hi to you. Then you have aberat nemo nisi Titus Cornelius Patruus Marci. So nobody, right? Nobody except Titus Cornelius, right? And nobody aberat was absent, you could say. So no one was absent except Titus Cornelius, the uncle, the Patruus Marci, right? The uncle of Marcus. So the brother of Cornelius, he's not there. You have palisper eam expectabat omnes, sed tandem quamquam ille nondum advenerat, convivae in triclinium ducti sunt. So you're saying for a short time, omnes, everyone, expectabat, everyone was waiting for eam, him, meaning for Uncle Titus, right? But finally, although he, ille, right, he had not arrived, it's pluperfect tense, advenerat, and it's nondum, he had not yet arrived, right? So although he had not yet arrived, the dinner guests, ducti sunt, they were led, perfect tense, passive voice, they were led into the triclinium, right? So again, the sequencing here is important. The pluperfect happens first. So first he didn't show up, right? And then they get led into the triclinium. So they go without him. You have solei depositae a servis ablatai sunt. Right? So here we have the solei depositae, right? So solei are the sandals. Depositae is a participle. You could say like having been taken off or set down, maybe is one way to do it, deposited, right? So the sandals having been taken off, ablatai sunt, perfect tense, passive voice. They were carried away or brought away by the slaves. Aservis is your ablative of agent, right? So they would take off their sandals and the sandals get carried away by the slaves. So now everyone's in the triclinium, right? Except Uncle Titus, but all the guests are there. They've taken their shoes off, and we have this final line. You have omnes in lectis acubuerant et canam expectabant. So omnes is everyone, right? So everyone now, right? Acubuerant, they reclined, right? Just perfect tense. They reclined in lectis on their, the beds, right? The couches that they're on. And expectabant, they were waiting for canam, dinner. So now the dinner party's about to start. Everyone's kind of settled in. They've greeted Cornelius. He's come said hi to them. They've taken their shoes off. And again, if you're lying on a couch, maybe with another person, you want to put your feet in their face. That's why they're taking the solei off. And now they're ready for dinner, right? So that's the end of the story. It's pretty straightforward, but there's a good amount of passive verbs here, particularly the perfect, the pluperfect and future perfect, which is good, right? So there's some good practice here. I think perfect tense shows up the most by far, but that's okay. You can still see how they all kind of work and relate to each other. So you want to just read through this practice and you'll get used to seeing this, right? The fourth principal part of a verb does have other uses, but when it's got the verb to be after it, this is what you're using it for. The perfect, pluperfect, or future perfect tense and the passive voice. So the other thing I just wanted to hit on quickly is there's a lot of death imagery in this story, right? And it's part of the culture unit for this chapter. I'd encourage you to look into it. Like I said, the story of Hercules comes up, Cerberus, Orpheus, all famous stories. So if you're wondering why they would do this, it's kind of interesting. It kind of gets at the Roman mindset of this idea of, if you're at dinner and you're having a party, right, which is what they do in the triclinium, live it up while you can is kind of the idea, right? Memento mori, remember that you'll die is the famous phrase. So if you're wondering why they would do that, it's to remind them that kind of life is short. Have fun while you're here, right? That would be kind of the appeal, I think, of seeing, this imagery in a triclinium. It's not to make it be a downer and make you think about death necessarily, but it's to make you realize, like, enjoy the moments that you're here because there's not, they're not guaranteed is kind of the idea. So I think that's why you have this imagery in the Cornelius's dining room. And if you're wondering, we kind of do similar things today, maybe not to this extent, but if you were to go, and this is a Puritan gravestone, right, from Puritan, Massachusetts, I believe. And if you look at it, you see these a lot in places like Salem, Mass, where you see these old cemeteries. They'll have the warnings on, right? They're not very friendly. So if you go to Salem and ever look at the old cemetery, they're not saying things like, here lies Johnny and he was great. No, they're almost always warnings of skeletons and people saying, hey, just remember, buddy, you're going to die too. So, while you're here, live it up because, one day you're going to be like me. So it's kind of a similar mentality, that idea of remember that you'll die and live it up while you can. That's kind of an interesting, point of view that some people have today. The Romans definitely had it too, because you're just not guaranteed it. And so that's just an interesting way to understand why you have so much death imagery in the triclinium in this story. But either way, that's the chapter 32 story. Hopefully you did pretty well with it. Again, if you're stuck on anything, I'd encourage you to go back, reread it, keep trying it and reading it until it's fluid and it makes sense and you feel like you have a good handle on it. If you have any questions at all, feel free to put them in the comments. I'll help you out however I can. But otherwise, just keep working on it. And like I always tell you, the more you do and the more you practice, the better off you're going to be.